The Boy King and the Hungry Wolves in 1697. The throne of the mighty Swedish Empire passed to a boy of 15. Charles XII was an anomaly in an age of powdered wigs and courtly intrigue. He was ascetic, single-minded, and possessed a fanatical, almost terrifying, devotion to warfare. He despised frivolity, spoke little, and found his only true joy in the harsh discipline of the military camp. His youth and inexperience were seen as a golden opportunity by Sweden's jealous neighbors. Sweden was the dominant power of the north, its empire a ring of territories controlling the lucrative Baltic Sea. In 1700, a secret coalition of 3 rulers, believing the Boy King would be an easy target, declared war. This triumvirate of hungry wolves consisted of Frederick IV of Denmark-Norway, who sought to reclaim lost provinces; Augustus the Strong of Poland-Saxony, who coveted Swedish Livonia; and most fatefully, the towering and ambitious Tsar of Russia. Peter I. Peter's goal was simple but profound: to break Sweden's stranglehold on the Baltic and seize a piece of coastline, a window to the west through which he could modernize his vast, isolated, and technologically backward tsardom. They expected a quick and easy victory. They had catastrophically misjudged their opponent. The blitzkrieg of a lion instead of cowering, the young Charles XII exploded into action with a speed and ferocity that stunned Europe. He did not wait for his enemies to unite. He decided to attack them one by one. In the summer of 1700, in a daring amphibious assault, he personally led his troops through the waves to land on the shores of Denmark. The move was so swift and unexpected that the Danes, their capital of Copenhagen threatened, were forced to sue for peace and exit the war almost immediately. One wolf had been caged in a matter of weeks. Charles then turned his attention to the largest and most immediate threat: the massive Russian army under Tsar Peter, which was besieging the strategic Swedish fortress of Narva in Estonia. In November 1700, Charles, at the head of a small relief army of around 10,000 men, marched on Narva, where a Russian force of nearly 40,000 lay entrenched. What followed was one of the most astonishing victories in military history. Under the cover of a blinding snowstorm, the Swedes attacked. The Swedish army, the Caroliner, was arguably the best trained and most disciplined fighting force in Europe, famous for its aggressive shock tactics of relentless volley fire, followed by a cold steel bayonet and sword charge. The Russian army, in contrast, was a large, poorly trained peasant levy, commanded by foreign mercenaries who barely spoke the language of their troops. The Swedish attack smashed through the Russian lines, creating mass panic. The Russian army dissolved into a terrified mob. The Battle of Narva was a spectacular, almost unbelievable Swedish victory. Charles XII, the Boy King, had humiliated the great Tsar and destroyed his army. He was now hailed across Europe as the invincible Lion of the North, a new Alexander the Great. The Polish quagmire. After the stunning victory at Narva, Charles XII made the most fateful strategic decision of his life. His generals urged him to march on Moscow, to finish off the weakened and demoralized Tsar Peter once and for all. But Charles, driven by a rigid sense of honor and a personal contempt for Augustus the Strong, whom he saw as an oath-breaker, decided to turn south. He would deal with Poland-Saxony first. Russia, he believed, was a primitive backwater that could be dealt with at his leisure. This decision would drag him into a multi-year quagmire. While Charles was a brilliant tactician, he was a poor strategist. He became obsessed with deposing Augustus the Strong and replacing him with his own puppet king on the Polish throne. For 6 years he chased Augustus across the vast plains of Poland and into Saxony, winning every battle but never achieving a decisive political victory. While Charles was bogged down in this Polish obsession, he gave his most dangerous enemy the one thing he desperately needed: time. Tsar Peter the Great was a man of immense energy and iron will, and he was not one to wallow in defeat. He took the humiliation of Narva as a brutal but necessary lesson. He understood that to defeat a modern Western army, he had to build one. He began a ruthless and frantic program of modernization. He melted down church bells to cast new cannons. He hired European officers, reorganized his army along Western lines, and imposed a system of lifelong conscription on his peasantry. And in 1703, on captured Swedish land at the mouth of the Narva River, he began to build his new, forward-looking capital, St. Petersburg, his window to the west. While Charles was chasing the ghost in Poland, Peter was methodically building the army and the state that would eventually consume him. The fateful march on Moscow by 1707, Charles XII had finally achieved his goal in Poland. He had deposed Augustus the Strong and installed his own candidate, Stanisław Leszewski, on the Polish throne. At the peak of his power, feared and respected throughout Europe, he finally turned his attention back to his primary foe. He was now ready to march on Moscow and dictate a final, humiliating peace to Tsar Peter. In the autumn of 1707, at the head of a magnificent, veteran army of nearly 40,000 men, the largest he had ever commanded, Charles marched out of Saxony. This was to be his ultimate campaign, the one that would break the power of Russia forever. The initial plan was to march directly on Moscow through Smolensk. But Tsar Peter, who had learned the hard lessons of Narva, refused to meet Charles in a decisive battle. Instead, Peter adopted a ruthless and effective scorched earth strategy. As the Swedes advanced, the Russian armies retreated, burning villages, destroying crops, and poisoning wells. The Swedish army, which was accustomed to living off the land, found itself marching through a devastated, empty landscape. The notoriously harsh Russian winter of 1708 to 1709, one of the coldest of the 18th century, set in with a vengeance. Men and horses froze to death in the biting cold. Starvation and disease began to ravage the Swedish ranks. The turn to Ukraine bogged down. His army slowly starving and freezing, Charles made another fateful decision. He abandoned the direct march on Moscow. Instead, he turned his army south, towards the fertile lands of Ukraine. He had been promised aid by a Ukrainian hetman, Ivan Mazepa, who sought to use the Swedes to break away from Russian rule and establish an independent Ukraine. It was a desperate gamble that ended in disaster. The expected Ukrainian uprising failed to materialize on a large scale. Worse, a crucial Swedish relief column, marching from the north with desperately needed supplies and reinforcements, was ambushed and destroyed by a Russian force at the Battle of Lesnaya. Peter the Great would later call this victory the mother of the Battle of Poltava. Charles's army, now completely cut off, isolated deep in hostile territory, and dwindling by the day, was forced to set up winter camp in Ukraine. By the spring of 1709, the magnificent army that had left Saxony was a shadow of its former self, a ragged band of starving survivors. The Battle of Poltava in the summer of 1709, seeking to force a confrontation and find supplies, Charles laid siege to the small but strategically important fortress of Poltava in central Ukraine. It was exactly what Peter the Great had been waiting for. He marched a new, massive, and reformed Russian army to confront the Swedes. The stage was set for the decisive battle of the Great Northern War. The Swedish army was in a desperate state. It numbered perhaps only 20,000 men, and its supplies of gunpowder were critically low. In a stroke of terrible luck, Charles XII himself, who always led from the front, had been wounded in the foot by a stray Russian bullet during a reconnaissance mission just days before the battle. He was unable to lead his men on horseback and had to be carried in a litter. On June 28, 1709, the Swedish army, a fraction of the size of the Russian force, launched a desperate attack on the heavily fortified Russian camp. The years of Peter's reforms now paid off. The new Russian army was not the terrified mob of Narva. They were a disciplined, professional force that stood its ground. They absorbed the initial Swedish shock attack and then used their overwhelming superiority in artillery and manpower to devastate the Swedish ranks. The battle turned into a slaughter. The Swedish army was annihilated. Charles, his litter shattered by a cannonball, was thrown onto a horse and managed to escape the battlefield with a small retinue, but his army was gone. A few days later, the remnants of the once invincible force surrendered to the Russians. Exile and the return. The Battle of Poltava was a thunderclap that completely reversed the course of the war and the fortunes of two nations. The Swedish Empire's power was broken in a single day. The new Russian Empire had arrived as a major European power. Charles XII, along with a handful of followers, fled south and became an unwanted guest of the Ottoman Sultan. For the next 5 years, he lived in exile in the Ottoman Empire, a king, without an army, relentlessly trying to persuade the Sultan to attack Russia. While he was away, his enemies pounced. Augustus the Strong reclaimed the Polish throne, and Russia, Denmark, and Prussia began to systematically carve up the Swedish Empire's territories around the Baltic. Finally, in 1714, after a series of bizarre adventures, Charles made an epic and legendary journey back to Sweden. He traveled incognito on horseback across the entire continent, a journey of over 1,300 miles in just 15 days. He arrived, haggard and unexpected, in his own lands to find his empire in ruins. The death of a lion undeterred by the catastrophic situation. The Lion of the North immediately set about raising a new army to continue the fight. His indomitable will had not been broken. He was still the absolute master of Sweden, and for the next few years he waged a desperate, heroic, but ultimately hopeless struggle against the coalition of his enemies. That in the winter of 1718, during an invasion of Norway, Charles XII was in the siege trenches, inspecting his troops at the fortress of Fredrikstad. As he peered over the parapet to view the enemy lines, a single bullet, whether from a Norwegian rifle or a Swedish assassin's pistol, is still debated by historians, struck him in the head, killing him instantly. The death of the warrior king immediately ended the war. The Swedish leadership sued for peace. The resulting treaties of 1721 confirmed the new reality. Sweden lost almost all of its overseas empire. Russia gained the territories it had craved, including Estonia and Livonia, securing its window to the west on the Baltic. The birth of an empire, the death of another. The Great Northern War had lasted for 21 years. It was a conflict that had been defined by the titanic personal struggle between two remarkable and opposing monarchs. Charles XII was a brilliant, almost superhuman tactician, a warrior of immense personal courage, but a reckless and obsessive strategist whose stubbornness led his empire to ruin. Peter the Great was a visionary, a brutal but pragmatic modernizer who was willing to learn from his own catastrophic defeats and who, in the end, achieved his great historical ambition. The war had brought about a permanent shift in the European balance of power. The Swedish Empire, which had dominated Northern Europe for a century, was finished as a great power. The Russian Empire, forged in the fires of the war and built on the foundations Peter had laid, was now a formidable and permanent player on the European stage. The long, bloody struggle that had begun with an attack on a boy king had ended with the spectacular birth of one empire and the dramatic death of another.